Welcome to this video, which is part of a series on the I'm Nessa Carey. I'm an entrepreneur in residence at the University of Oxford. And one of the things that I specialise in is supporting academics in making the transition from an academic research idea into something that has impact outside of academia, and particularly via a commercial route. And the commercial route is what we're very much going to focus on in this case study. And that's because if there's no commercial case for developing a medical device, if nobody wants it or needs it or is willing to pay for it, there is probably no point you continuing to develop it. And so looking at the commercial case is something that you need to do very, very early on when exploring your idea. It's not a straightforward process. It usually has highs and lows associated with it, and that's perfectly normal. So don't worry if you run into some problems. What you do is you try and address those problems and you see if the idea is looking as good as you initially thought it was. Sometimes it may not be, sometimes it may be better than you originally realised. So let's talk about the case study that we're going to examine. I've built this around a real case. It was a set of discussions that I had with an academic, not actually at Oxford, but I've changed the device and I've changed the medical indication for it to protect confidentiality, because this is something that's now being developed commercially. So the technical details of the device are completely imaginary, so you don't need to worry about those. They don't make any sense whatsoever, but that isn't the point. What I want you to assume is that the specificity and selectivity of this device have already been demonstrated in a very small to medium-sized clinical trial. So there's already clinical data showing that this device does actually work in an appropriate medical setting. However, that is not the same as having a medical device for which there is a commercial need. And so what we're going to be doing in this case study is showing you the kind of questions that a commercially aware expert will bring to an analysis. And these are to complement the scientific skills of the inventor. They're not undermining them. This is a partnership when you're working on something like this. We'll deal with the regulatory and technical aspects of developing medical devices in other training materials in this series, so I'm not going to focus on those here. When I was working with the researcher, we did actually discuss some of those, but that's not the bit that I'm going to talk about. And at each stage, I'll show you the key things that we learnt as we went through the process together, in terms of not what we learnt about the device itself, but in terms of what you need to take away when you're running this sort of thought process for yourself. So here's what I was originally told. I sat down with an academic and this is what he told me. So he's created a new medical device. It's a transcervical test. So basically, a device is inserted through the vagina and it can measure congenital defects in developing fetuses. Better than anything else that exists at the moment. And the academic thought the market would be enormous because there's a lot of pregnant women, even if we just look at the UK. He can manufacture the device for 2,800 and wanted to sell it for 3,200 to create a lot of profit. And he thought the best way to do this would be to set up a company because there was a really important commercial opportunity there. He had filed a couple of patents along with the support of his university, and as I mentioned earlier, had clinical trial data. So that was the starting thing that the researcher told me. And so I asked him my very first question, which is a fairly typical one, which is, tell me more about the market size, please, because I was being brought in predominantly to do the commercial analysis. So I said, okay, you said there's a big market. How big is the market? And this is what he told me. So I asked the researcher to tell me about the market, and this is essentially what he told me. Congenital defects are the commonest form of fetal abnormality in the UK. 66% are detected prenatally, of which 42% of these cases lead to TOPFA. In 2018, there were a total of 13,400 babies with one or more congenital abnormalities notified to NCARDS out of 628,171 total births in England. This gives an overall birth prevalence of 213.3 per 10,000 total births. 50 out of every 10,000 are chromosomal, such as Downs, Edwards or Patau. About the same number are cardiac, and about 29.8 are of these 10,000 are limb abnormalities. So that is what the academic told me when I asked him about the market. And for me, that immediately raised various questions. So here are the questions that immediately started coming into my head. The first is, what is TOPFR? It was an expression I'd never heard before. The next thing I was thinking was, well, existing methods already detect 2/3 of these abnormalities. Is there really a residual opportunity? Is there enough improvement that can be created by this technology to create a genuinely commercial opportunity? And the next question was the same as my first question: what's the market size? The reason why these questions are significant: what is TOPFR? Well, TOPFR stands for Termination of Pregnancy for Fetal Abnormality. To the researcher, this was such common parlance that he didn't think to describe it, because he is completely embedded in his field. And therefore, he just assumes that everyone else knows the same thing that he knows. When you're trying to investigate commercialization of something, when you're trying to communicate about it, don't assume that everybody else knows the same things you do. Step back and think how you would communicate this to somebody who actually won't necessarily know the same clinical information as you. The 66% already detected, where's the residual opportunity? The reason I need to know about this is that if it's only a minor improvement, if, for example, it pushes that 66 up to, I don't know, 71, would that really be enough to drive adoption of this device in the clinic and in the marketplace? The fact that it's a new approach might be irrelevant if it's not developing some sort of benefit for the end users. And when I asked about the market size, the researcher told me about the clinical need. There may be complete misalignment between the clinical need and the market size, and this is something we'll explore more. So, key lessons: speak plainly. Take a step back, and it's really hard to do because you're an expert in your field. This means you are unconsciously skilled. You don't even realise how much you know. And therefore, you need to learn to articulate why your innovation is better than the existing solution, because there will always be something that's already there doing part of this job. And when you are trying to articulate that, you don't obsess about the technical features of your device. What you articulate about are the benefits it will bring to the people who use it. It doesn't really matter at this stage how it brings those benefits. You will need to incorporate that thought later. But first of all, just think, is it actually better or is it just different? Essentially, what problem does it solve and why does that problem matter? And who is it solving the problem for? So you need to step away from your idea and look at it as if you were an outsider. The other learning from this point is the one I already mentioned. Just because there is an unmet clinical need doesn't automatically guarantee a commercial opportunity. There's a very simple way of showing this is true. 800,000 children a year die from diarrhea. There is a clear clinical need to prevent that, but there isn't a commercial opportunity, because if there were, somebody would have exploited it by now, and those children would not be dying. For various reasons, it has proven very difficult to address that huge number of deaths from diarrhea via a commercial approach. Now, that may seem like an extreme example that has nothing to do with monitoring of pregnancies in the NHS, but the same principle applies even in well-funded healthcare systems. So even in state systems like the NHS, even in insurance-based systems, there may be a mismatch between the clinical need that you can address, but the commercial opportunity for doing so, because it might be that actually there is no commercial driver for it, that, for example, your approach would be so expensive, it doesn't make sense in health economic terms. So don't assume that just because lots of people would benefit from this medically, that means the commercial route is one that is viable for you. So we both stepped back a bit and we spent a lot of time essentially chatting, talking about how exactly this approach would be better. And one of the key things I needed to know was, what would it change? Because if it gave detection of fetal abnormalities, but you couldn't do anything clinically as a result of that, how does that benefit anybody? Why is that better? And I needed the academic to be able to articulate this so that I could check there really was an opportunity. And this just required a lot of conversation. And it requires a lot of asking the really dumb, really obvious questions of saying, no, I don't understand, tell me what will happen. And those can be very difficult questions for researchers to answer because, again, it's this unconsciously skilled problem. They think it's entirely obvious what will be improved, but it may not be obvious to everyone. And you need to test your assumptions. So here's where we got to. Why the new approach has benefits, not why it's different, not how the technology works, but why it is beneficial. So we got to a table that looked a bit like this. The current approach has a sensitivity of X. But if this new approach could be implemented, the sensitivity, i.e. how well it detected abnormalities, would be increased to X plus. And plus is a clinically meaningful improvement. It may vary for different devices and different indications. But it wasn't just a marginal improvement, it was a clinically meaningful improvement. And so this approach had a real benefit, potentially, of being more sensitive at detecting abnormalities. And therefore, there'd be increased confidence in decision making. We'd be much more confident at saying if that abnormality had been present, we would have detected it. If we think about the current approach and its false positive rate, i.e. the number of times it suggests there's an abnormality when really there isn't, let's call that existing false positive rate Y. The academic was able to convince me, based on his clinical data, that the new approach would have a false positive of Y minus minus, where the minus is clinically meaningful improvement, i.e. you got far fewer false positives. That again has real benefits. It means far fewer women would then have to have further screens. That is a good thing. It saves money. It is better clinical safety because almost every screen that you do, especially if it requires anything like amniocentesis, for example, carries a clinical risk. And it decreases the parental anxiety. The women and their families don't have days or weeks of wondering if there is something wrong with the fetus that she's carrying, only to find out at the subsequent scan that it was all fine. This was just a false positive. So we were then able to show that this technique would be more sensitive and have a lower false positive rate. Those are both really helpful things. The other improvement is that the existing method detects fetal abnormalities at 19 weeks of gestation. This method could detect them at 13 weeks. That means it can be carried out at the same time as the initial dating scan, which happens at 13 weeks of pregnancies. That will identify fetal abnormalities earlier, and that has genuine advantages. For example, there may be clinical interventions, perhaps for cardiac abnormalities. These can sometimes be treated in utero. It will give clinical decisions a longer time in which to be developed and a longer time in which clinical planning can be made because it's happening 6 weeks earlier. It allows earlier decisions about termination of pregnancy, and typically the earlier the termination, the less traumatic it is for the parents, and it will likely facilitate more termination of pregnancies for fetal abnormalities because of that decreased trauma. So that results in cost savings for families, for NHS, for society, because the terminations are easier to do and cheaper to do at an earlier stage of pregnancy. So those are the things that, after much discussion, we were able to list in the positives column. But that doesn't necessarily mean we would be right about them. There is still a lot more to establish. Although the researcher said that he had clinically significant improvements in sensitivity and in specificity, we would need subsequently to go out and explore with professionals in this field, were those improvements as clinically significant as he believed? Were they ones, for example, that could be implemented into workflows at lots of dating scans rather than just in a very specialised clinic such as the one in which he operated. Also, we think, or rather he thought, that the termination of pregnancies earlier and in greater number would be perceived as a benefit, but we need to understand if that really is the case for parents. And we need to think about the ethical issues of that, because there are always ethical issues with termination of pregnancy. So it's not that we had reached a definitive situation, but what we had reached was a situation where we were able to say, yes, there are definitely benefits. And we will need to explore those more, but now that we are confident that there are benefits to this technology, let's go on and look at some other questions associated with it. So this is all about a stepwise de-risking. So here was my second question, which is exactly the same as my first one. Can we go back to the market size, please? Because, okay, now I know that there are benefits, but I still don't know if the market size is big enough to justify taking this technology forward. So the researcher said to me, well, as I told you, it's huge. There are over 700,000 pregnancies in the UK alone every year, and all those 700,000 women will use the test. Fine. What I said then, because I realised I'd had trouble communicating what I was really asking when I was asking about the market size, was, but where will those tests take place? And that was the key question. That started the researcher thinking in a different way. He said, oh, I see what you mean, it will be in maternity clinics. So my obvious question was, how many maternity clinics in the UK perform routine screening? And he didn't know off the top of his head, so we went on to Google. Other search engines are available. Weirdly, it turned out to be really difficult to find out how many clinics in the UK carry out prenatal screening. And because it was difficult to find out, we did what all good commercial analysts do, which is that we took a guess at it. That's fine at this stage in an analysis. You make a guess based on the data with which you're comfortable. You build in some kind of parameters to it, and you accept that this is something that you're going to have to firm up later. You're just trying to get an idea. Is it 1? Is it 1,000? That's the kind of thing you're trying to get to. So this is what we did. We worked out there were probably around 1,300 hospitals in the UK. It's the right kind of number. It takes into account private hospitals as well. And then we had to make an assumption of what percentage of these offers prenatal screening, and we assumed it would be a quarter. I suspect that's too high, but it was a starting point. So we assumed 1,300 hospitals, a quarter of whom offer prenatal screening. And then we said, well, each of them will need more than one device, because they've probably got more than one clinic going at once. Let's say they've got 2 clinics going, or they can take 2 patients at each time. And let's say that means they need 2 devices plus 1 in the back in case one breaks down. So let's assume each one will need 3 devices. That seemed not unreasonable. So once we ran the really not very complicated maths on this, we realised that there was a huge difference between what the academic had assumed would be the market size and the actual market size. Because yes, there are 700,000 pregnancies a year in the UK, but these probably take place at only around 300 clinics in terms of screening. So even if each clinic buys 3 of your devices, that's less than 1,000 devices in total. And that's a very, very different proposition from thinking there's hundreds of thousands of opportunities here. So this again was a key learning point. It's that the customers and the beneficiaries are potentially different. You have to focus, if you're going down a commercial route, on your customers. And by customers, you mean the people or organisations who will pay you money. So that was not going to be the pregnant women. This is going to be the hospitals and the clinics where prenatal screening is carried out. It may be more complicated than that as well. If it's a centralised health service, such as the NHS, what you also have to understand is how those clinics are reimbursed by the central funding. So will they actually be incentivised to use your device? Or will it be a case that they invest in your device, but it doesn't actually influence their funding streams? Because that can be a really big disincentive. That's even more of a disincentive if you're creating something that will probably be used in GP surgeries. You really need to understand what are the commercial and monetary constraints that influence the screens, for example, and the services that GPs offer. So you have to understand not just who your customers are, but also how they are incentivized or disincentivized to use certain procedures. That's absolutely vital because that's your market. But perhaps there is still an opportunity, because as the researcher told me, he can manufacture the device for 2,800 and sell it for 3,200. It will generate lots of profit. So if we've got 975 devices at £400 a device profit, well, that comes in at just under £400,000. Now, if somebody offered me £400,000 in my pocket, I'd be very, very happy. It's a lot of money for an individual. But it may not be enough money to sustain a business, because after all, there are lots of costs in running a business. And so there was a lot of uncertainty that needed to be explored here. And I needed to understand certain things about those predictions from the academic in order to help assess if there is a commercial case. So here were some of the questions that I asked. The first was, how does he know how much it cost to manufacture this device? And it turned out that he had the cost from having prototypes made for the clinical trials. And he assumed that this would be discounted when the device was manufactured in higher numbers. That's not necessarily a safe assumption. A prototype might be fairly cheap compared to the manufactured final product, and that's because the final commercial product may have to fulfill different requirements. It would almost certainly need to look better than the prototype. There may be various things that have to be built into it that you didn't have to use as a prototype, but you will have to when you're creating sales items. And so the prototype may actually be cheaper to manufacture than the final commercial product. So that starts making a difference to those numbers. Because if, for example, it doesn't cost 2,800 to manufacture, at scale it costs 3,000, well, you've immediately halved your margin there. Then I asked, had he factored in all the costs, staff, marketing, sales, ongoing IP protection, regulatory submissions, etc.? Because all of these will need to be in place if he's going to develop this device and it be registered and then sold commercially, and he had not factored in any of that. So that again will drive up the costs and start cutting that margin. So at that point you need to start thinking about the most cost-effective way to get this to market. You need to think about which costs are optional and which are unavoidable, and there are unavoidable costs in creating medical devices because they have to go through regulatory pathways, for example. What are the size of these costs? All of this is eating away at that profit margin, and none of it was factored in. Then, how often will the device need to be replaced? And of course, there was no way of knowing this at the moment. There were no data on the longevity of the device. It's important to know that because you could end up with very lumpy cash flows. If all the clinics buy 3 devices in year 1 and then none of them start replacing it until year 5, how are you going to get income during those 4 years? And how are you going to be able to maintain the manufacturing capability? That's a really big problem. So you need to start factoring in what will happen if it has to be changed every year. What if it's only every 5 years? If it's every year, yes, that's more money, but will clinics be willing to pay for it? And then I also said, you said you were going to price this device at £400 above cost. How did you decide on this amount? And that was just what had seemed reasonable to the academic. He didn't want to overprice it. He thought that seemed reasonable. He didn't want to be unfair to anyone. But there will be specific markups in specific fields. That might seem very reasonable to the academic, the amount that he'd chosen, but it might actually not be reasonable at all. It might be far too small, it might be far too big. And it's important to find out the market norms, because otherwise you don't really know where you're heading. You don't know how much this is going to cost, and you don't know how much profit you can make on it. And those are very important questions. I didn't expect the academic to have answers to them. What I wanted was to get him thinking about them and for me to understand where the areas of uncertainty were so that I could flag those up for the university as things they would need to explore if they decided to support this innovation going forwards. So here's the key learning if you're thinking of developing a medical device. The commercial world is more complex and expensive than you might think because there are all sorts of hidden costs, and hidden costs that in many cases cannot be avoided. So you must test the assumptions behind your projections, and you need to do some market research. But more importantly, you need to understand how the field really works. And the best way of doing this is talking to people who have worked in the field. Talk to people who have developed medical devices or commercialized medical devices, because otherwise you will find you move forward with certain assumptions and things you didn't even know you didn't know about will come and will completely take your feet out from under you. So you have to start getting advice. It is very complex. And we're starting to feel a bit gloomy because it seemed like I was saying the market size is really very small. And I don't think you can assume that £400 per device is actually reasonable or actually obtainable. And also, this doesn't look like a company because the cash flow could be incredibly lumpy. Now, just because it doesn't look like this is something where you should set up a spin-out company doesn't mean there isn't a commercial opportunity. You might, for example, want to out-license the intellectual property to an existing medical devices or pregnancy specialist company, and they may develop this and it might be a useful addition to their portfolio, but it wasn't looking as if this was enough to sustain a company on its own. And I could see that the researcher was getting a bit disheartened about this. And really, I'm not surprised, because he was very excited about this technology. He was very excited about the good it could do in the world. And I really, really didn't want to destroy that enthusiasm. I just needed to take it in a different direction. Because, like all academics, he cared intensely about his research, and he cared intensely about the fact that he might make positive impact from it. And that is a deeply personal emotion. So that was a really good point at which to say, let's have a cup of tea, okay? And let's just talk about something else for 20 minutes and let everything filter through our brains and see if there's more things we can explore here. So that was important. And this is a key learning. Give yourself time to think. Trying to develop a medical device or indeed any product is really difficult and frustrating, and it doesn't happen overnight. You will hit problems. So don't assume that those problems mean everything is a disaster. Take a break, allow your brain time to reset and to think about other things. Think about other approaches. This could be as simple as a 20-minute coffee break with a biscuit. It could be that you need to put something aside for a few weeks and just let your brain do the job that it does really, really well of coming up with solutions, if there are solutions to be found. So I'd had a biscuit, my blood sugar was right back up, and I thought, there's still something I don't really understand about this device. And the job of the commercial expert is to ask stupid questions and not be embarrassed about the questions being stupid. So I said, this is a device that's used to obtain a measurement via the vagina. Incidentally, the academic described this device as non-invasive. Myself and the two other women in the room all crossed our legs at that point because it didn't seem very non-invasive to us. So again, be very careful what you mean by terminology when you're describing something. By non-invasive, he meant it didn't mean taking a blood sample, but I don't think most women would view this as non-invasive. So be very careful how you describe things. But anyway, we'd established that this took a measurement via the vagina. And I said, so how do you sterilise it between examinations? And I needed to know that because that would influence the number of machines that needed to be bought. Because if you had to sterilise the whole machine between every examination, well, then clinics were going to need far more of the machines because it takes time to sterilise things. But also it would make it much less practical in its uptake. So I thought, I don't really get this. I'm going to ask, how do you sterilise it between examinations? And the academic said, oh, no, there's no need to sterilise it. It has a disposable tip, and that covers the probe, and the tip will be single use. Now, he had shown me diagrams of the prototype. He hadn't actually brought one with him, which was unfortunate. He'd shown me diagrams, but none of the diagrams had the disposable tip on them. They all just had the probe. So once I realised that, I started feeling a bit cheerier because I could see another way to go with this project. Because if we run the numbers again, 700,000 pregnancies a year, and every woman is scanned twice at 13 and 19 weeks. Well, that's just under 1.5 million scans a year. Even being conservative and assuming just a 50p profit per tip, that's £750,000 per annum. Now that is a lot better than just under 400,000 in total. That starts looking a bit more sustainable. So I cheered up at that point. The combination of the biscuit and a renewed commercial opportunity did wonders for our mood. Doesn't mean that everything's fine now. There's still loads of assumptions to test. But the opportunity is looking a lot bigger, and that makes it look more sustainable as a money-making business. Again, it doesn't necessarily mean that it will function well as a spin-out. That may still not be enough money, but it certainly starts looking like a more attractive commercial opportunity for, say, licensing to another company, or perhaps continuing down the spin-out route once you've done a lot more analysis of the market. But it does mean we can see a bit of a way forward. So the key learning here was identify where the value lies. Which aspect of the product will generate the most income? And it may not be the aspect that you first assume, because to the academic, what was so exciting about this device was the underlying technology, because that was the really clever technical bit. But commercially, that really clever technical bit might simply be the gateway to the more boring part, which actually makes the money. So really think about how it's going to be used and which bit is valuable. And actually, this issue of the disposable tip is part of a very, very old and established business model. And it was originally created by either Gillette or Wilkinson Sword, I can't remember which, but it was the razor and blades model. So this is when that model was first really developed. So the manufacturers would sell the razor quite cheaply because they would make all the money on the disposable blades, which you can see is a perfect analogy for this situation with the medical device and the disposable tips. We all buy into this now. If you have one of those fancy coffee makers, the money isn't made on the coffee maker itself, it's made on the coffee pods that you buy. An even more familiar and more extreme example is printers. Printers are so ridiculously cheap now. They basically give away the printers simply to get you hooked on buying the ink, because the ink is where the money is. And that's a really useful model. It's a very successful business model, and it's a model that investors understand as well. Another example is Adobe, which does the thing of they give you Adobe Acrobat and Reader fairly for free as the basic model, but if you want the enhanced features, then you start paying for them. So these are called the freemium or the razor and blades models, and they're really useful models for anything that has a disposable associated with it. So if we're looking at £750,000 profit each year based on the tips, one of the things you really have to think when you do a commercial analysis is where would be the threat to that? What could mean that that profit started to slide away from us if we set up a company or we out-license this? Because here's what you have to be worried about. Your device sells really well, but then other companies start to sell compatible tips at a lower price, and your market share is eroded and your profits fall. Think about razors. Still, the model that's used is that companies like Wilkinson Sword or Gillette, they'll sell the razor itself, and they are very careful to make sure that there are no other razor blades on the market that will fit their model. Because once you've bought that razor, they want you buying only their razor blades. And you need to do the same if you're creating a medical device that has disposables on it, and if that's where your profit lies. So now I need to know even more. I needed to know everything that was created as part of the device and how it works, because I was starting to understand much better the commercial case for this device, which is very much the razor and blades model. And so I need to understand how you stop that market share being eroded. And we had a very, very long discussion where the academic kept telling me about the mechanoelectrical sensor, which was the really clever bit of his device from his point of view. But I was able to say, show me everything that your prototype relied on to work. And so there was the sensor. That was the really clever technical bit. There were the tips. But there was also software. So the software that took the reading from the sensor and converted it into another type of readout. And then there were the prediction algorithms, which meant from that readout the device could predict if there was a fetal abnormality. But there were also other components to this. There was the way the device was put together. There were the instruction manuals, how to use it. There was the wireless interface, so it would connect directly with hospital systems, iPads, etc. There were aspects that had been built into the design that made it much easier to use as a consequence of feedback from clinicians. And also a very valuable aspect of this were the existing clinical data, which meant that this device was ahead of anything else that might come through quickly. So there was a lot that was embedded in this device, and it's really important to understand all those components. So we went through all that, and the academic said to me, but it's fine because I filed 2 patents, so all of that is covered. I've got total protection over this. Well, no, he absolutely didn't, because some of these aspects need to be covered by different types of intellectual property. Some of it is not patentable, but that doesn't mean it doesn't have value. So it's important to understand all the components that you have and how you can protect them and how you can package them together. You'll need lots of different types of intellectual property protection. Copyright on, say, some of the software, but copyright on the instruction manuals. Now, copyright is automatically generated in terms of your protection. You don't necessarily have to file copyright, but you might want to in some territories. You might have database rights. There will be design rights, how this is put together and why it's put together in a particular way. And the other thing you have to keep thinking about is, how do you build commercial loyalty? How do you keep your customers coming back to you so that they never at any point switch to the equivalent of a different razor and start buying the different razor blades? And there are various ways you do this. You need to start thinking about post-sales support, user groups. How often will you upgrade? And you build these into your IP strategies so that you can continue to build and protect value. Essentially what you're trying to do is this. In medieval times, there were 2 ways of building towers. One was to build them square. The problem with square towers is they have cornerstones, which literally are exactly what they say, stones at the corner around which the rest of the tower is built. The problem is, if the enemy has cannonballs or battering rams or trebuchets or whatever, and they manage to knock out a cornerstone, your entire tower starts to crumble. That's because they've undermined one fundamental thing on which the tower depended. The much more effective way of building towers was to build them round. Then there were no cornerstones and there were no points of weakness. And it made it much harder to damage these towers substantially. And that's what you want to create with an IP portfolio. You want there to be a round tower of intellectual property protection, so that even if a competitor starts trying to nibble away at one bit of it, they can't undermine your entire product and your entire commercial portfolio, because you've got loads of other protection around the product as well. So always try and think in terms of, how do I create a round tower of intellectual property protection? And you'll have specialists who can help you with this, but it would be useful if you go into those discussions understanding that this is what you're trying to achieve and understanding how to explain all the different aspects to your innovation. So the key learning point is, think about the device in its entirety and identify all aspects of the device that contribute to the value for the customer. And if there are bits that aren't creating value, think if there are ways that you can change them so that they do. Think if you can make stuff less generic and more effective. And then you create a strong IP portfolio to protect these. Try and think like your competitors, because it's a big world out there. If your device becomes successful, other companies are going to look at it and think, I want a share of that enhanced market. I'm going to try and create something better, or something that doesn't even need to be better, but is maybe not, well, is probably as effective but cheaper. Might not look as nice, but I can squeeze it into the marketplace. You need to create an IP portfolio that stops other organisations from doing that. Because you need to start thinking like the competitor. You need to look at your innovation and think, where are its weak spots and how do I strengthen those? So that's the process we went through. And you really need to remember this, that we hadn't reached a definitive answer on anything. So I kind of like this Churchill quote. Now this is not the end. It is not even the beginning of the end, but it is perhaps the end of the beginning. What we were doing was exploring areas that we needed to dig into more, and also seeing if there was anything that gave us comfort that it was worth moving forward more on this innovation. And I think we did develop enough comfort around that. But it was actually taking the commercial discussion in a direction that had not been expected. The original expectation was it was all going to be about the device and sales of the device. Actually, the device is just the gateway drug to get people hooked on your disposable tips. That seemed to be where the commercial value lay. And so there were loads of further questions to be taken up, but we were on a much better direction of travel, and we knew it was worth continuing with those discussions. As we mentioned before, the commercial aspect is only one side of this. You need to keep the commercial case under exploration at the same time as you keep exploring the technical and the regulatory aspects, because there might be a fantastic commercial case, but if you can never actually get the device technically good enough to fulfill that commercial opportunity, it's not going to work. And if you can move forward knowing there's a market and technically your device works, but the regulators will never accept it because, I don't know, it has a chance of blowing up or something, or you just can't demonstrate that all the parts are reliable or can be manufactured to a consistent standard, then again, there is no point moving forward. But I would always argue the commercial case is the one to focus on first, because if there is no potential market that you understand and can access, there is no point making this technically better or starting to think, yes, that would fulfill the regulators' requirements. It will do those things, but nobody will buy it in sufficient numbers to make it worth going forward with. Get help from specialists at all stages. This is like three-dimensional chess. You need to keep yourself well informed and getting good advice from all three domains, technical, regulatory and commercial, and you also need people who will help you integrate that. And the specialists at the university can absolutely help with this process. They can connect you to the right people. They also have experience of protecting complex innovations like this, so make sure you know who the people are at Oxford who can help with this, and go and start talking to them and talk to them early. And that's it. I hope this has been helpful. I hope it's given you more confidence in actually going out and exploring the opportunities for your innovations, and it will be exciting to see what you come up with.